Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, I am honored to welcome a remarkable guest, Peter Murphy Lewis, filmmaker, long-term care advocate, and founder of Strategic Pete. Welcome, Peter. How are you?
Wonderful. Excited to be here, Lance.
Our pleasure. You know, I introduced you as a long-term advocate. I want to kind of start there. What is it that brought you into our space of being a long-term care advocate? Do you have a personal story or?
It's a professional story that turned into a personal story.
Awesome.
So I got recruited to work in an electronic healthcare records company about 5 years ago for a private equity. And I started a podcast in the healthcare space. And when I started interviewing executives in long-term care, I realized that it was more than just a salary. I started to fall in love with it. And I started to connect with the fact that my father was an amazing caregiver for his parents that had dementia right when I moved to South America when I was 24 years old. And so about 5 to 10 years of my grandparents' life, I wasn't there for them. I was in South America, created my life, meeting my wife, having a kid, and my father and a bunch of CNAs were taking care of my grandparents. And I realized that I had a lot of guilt around that and started to deal with that. And I said, well, there's one way I can pay back the caregivers is I can take my experience in documentaries and TV and do shows about the amazing caregivers in this industry. So it started off professional and then came back as something about connecting with my grandparents that were so important to me.
Oh, that's incredible, Peter. You know, you kind of had mentioned it, you know, and I had introduced you as a filmmaker. What inspired you to begin filming people worth caring about? And you kind of mentioned a little bit, but how did it become more personal for you than professional?
Yeah, so the story, the short version of the story was I was doing a keynote at Nebraska Healthcare Association. I think it was around LinkedIn, actually, or maybe personal branding. I don't remember. And I told the CEO afterwards, I said, I've done a bunch of television, about 10 years of television in South America, showing people's passion in life through their work. I said, why don't we do something like that in long-term care? And she said, let's do it. And the first show was born, and it was life-changing for me. My father saw the premiere. My wife and my mom and my son saw the premiere at a huge theater in Nebraska in October. And my dad said it was one of the most beautiful things he'd ever been involved with and seen. And then I filmed for Ohio. And in 3 weeks, I'm flying to New Mexico. So it ended up being something that I never knew I would ever make $1 off of, because a lot of times passion is passion, but I was able to find a need and line it up with my skills and my passion at the same time.
That's incredible. You know, there's a lot of crossover in my mind, at least. A good friend of ours, Susie Singer Carter, you know, she was a filmmaker, you know, and she's now making a film documentary called No Country for Old People. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all. No? Okay. No. I'll have to introduce you guys. And, you know, her story originated from her mother having, you know, gone into a facility, and it just changed the entire trajectory of, you know, where her focus lies. She now has the podcast Love Conquers Alls, and she was one of the films she created was just called Soul Surfer. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, neat. I gotta meet it.
It's a great movie. It's a little bit older, and you know, I've been on her show a couple of times. She's been on ours a few times, and you know, I have younger children, and they love the movie Soul Surfer. It's a true story, very well done, and Susie makes a small cameo appearance in the film, but she's like the producer of the film or co-producer, whatever the role is. And the last time she was on, she's like, I got a really cool surprise for you. And next thing I know, the main actress who plays the surfer, and I'm blanking on the name right now, Susie hunted down a life-size poster of the movie, sent it to the actress in New York City. Actress wrote a really awesome message to my kids, and it was sent to our house. It was one of the coolest things for my kids. So the point and the moral of that story is kind of like how you're sharing with your personal experience, never thinking you'd make a buck off it. You know, it became a passion. And this, you know, Susie's like the tip of the spear when it comes to this stuff. And just, you know, I love seeing people get involved in this that otherwise may not have been, because it helps to raise the awareness. It helps to bring these, you know, issues to life, and it brings it into your home for people that may not have any idea about what it's like, you know, dealing with long-term care and, you know, when these issues started rising in their family. So thank you very much for, you know, doing the work you're doing. Kind of staying with that trend, Peter, what is the biggest misconception that the public has about long-term care, and how did it really change your misconceptions that you may have had at the onset?
I don't know if I have a number one misconception. I'll go with what comes to mind. The first thing that I thought of is that long-term care is a place that you go to die. And I would say, even from an employee point of view, right? Like, you think that you would never want to go work in a long-term care facility, and you're very wrong. I've interviewed 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 70-year-olds. The 70-year-old tried to retire twice, and she couldn't because it was her family. And I have just realized that it's such a great industry. There's a lot of things that are hard. But I think the very first misconception is that, you know, like, if you have a big heart, if you like to babysit, if you like to take care of your neighbor's dogs, if you like to go check on your elderly neighbor, you should go check out long-term care. I always tell Jaylene from the Nebraska Healthcare Association, when we make this documentary, my goal, Lance, is to take 16-year-olds away from Walmart and Target and Dillon's and Kroger's and bring them into long-term care, because they can make a career out of it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I learned, I think I knew this in my subconscious, but I had never manifested it in these words. I recently filmed an episode with a woman named Lavita Wright in Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, and she worked in the memory care unit most of her life. And she said she couldn't imagine anywhere else. And she said something really interesting. She said, most of our residents' family, and even more so in America, were afraid of dementia. We think that dementia could rub off on you. Now, I'd never thought about that, but having grandparents who had dementia, I realized that people were really uncomfortable around them, and they thought it was contagious.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, you know, I'd love to hear you mention, you know, the 15, 16, you know, the teenager years. You know, we just did an interview yesterday, and we were talking about some of the different, you know, budgetary cuts and funding issues. And one of the issues that I think is getting overlooked is the intergenerational, you know, aspect, where, you know, a lot of colleges have these programs either for older learning, where people go back later in life to just educate themselves and to get engaged, but also where you have these programs where students are engaging with the senior population, maybe going and interviewing people at these facilities, or, you know, volunteering, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And, you know, like with my children's school, every Christmas, the kids that play an instrument and the kids that sing in the choir, they'll go to a couple of the facilities, and it's more intergenerational. It's not charity work. It is something that the seniors look forward to, the kids look forward to. You'll have, you know, an 8th grade student and a 80-year-old man sitting at the piano and co-playing a Christmas carol, while, you know, a senior and one of the students is playing the violin to, you know, Holy Night or something. And, you know, I think it's important that the kids see that and have a respect, because, you know, growing up in South America and spending the time you spent there, I know just from our company, we're the one culture, I feel like, or the one society in the world where we tend to more go away from our seniors rather than go towards them, where other cultures and, you know, societies, they tend to cleave towards their seniors out of respect and a sense of duty. And I love that you brought that up, and it's such a great point, Peter.
Mm. Yeah, my mind when you were talking about the high school students, there was a beautiful episode that I filmed in the middle of Nebraska about a year ago, and it's a beautiful assisted living place. And every senior, every prom, all of the students drive up to the front of the assisted living. There are seniors, there are residents who come out and chaperone, no, what valet their cars and go park them. The seniors get out of their car in their gowns, walk through all of the halls. All the residents are outside clapping for them, cheering for them, and then they go back and get in their cars. How beautiful of a tradition is that?
That is very cool. That's really cool. Yeah, is that something that they started themselves, or because I haven't heard of anything like that? Okay, what a great idea.
Yeah, that's the executive director who doesn't know how to retire.
Okay, all right, that's a great idea. We're talking about a lot of good moments and a lot of good aspects, but I also know, the reality is there's some tougher times in these facilities. A lot of difficult days and situations. What was one of the most difficult days that you had while filming the series?
Most difficult that I've had. My job's pretty easy, Lance. So I think it's more difficult for my director because I just show up and talk and get to interact with beautiful people who are passionate and want to be there. I always equate it to I've created a travel company in South America that I owned for almost 20 years and sold it. I always say one of the great things about working in tourism is everybody wants to be there when you see them. And the people that I got to highlight on people worth caring about were the same. But what has been the hardest for me is, so when I got into this world of long-term care 5 years ago, I decided I wanted to go learn what it means to be a caregiver. So I went and became a certified nurse's assistant in Kansas and learned about that. I was in a room with, I think, 7 single moms, and it was really cool. And then I went and did my training, and that experience was powerful, emotional. I think I connected with kind of 2 main things there. One, with a woman who was nonverbal, and my supervisor told me, he said, Peter, we're going to bathe her. She's going to pass tomorrow. And we bathed her a day before she passed. And, I don't think most of America knows that there are caregivers who will never be on television, never be on a documentary, never be on this podcast, who are bathing our parents and our grandparents, and no one else would know except for some chart that nobody will ever see. That was really powerful. And then the second item was, there was a gentleman who had a lot of had severe dementia, and they had trouble getting him to eat. And I'm a big believer in the 5 languages of love. It's saved my marriage. It's made me a better son. It's made me a better dad, better neighbor, and everything. And so I tried, even though I couldn't really communicate with him too well, I tried to figure out what his love language was. And I figured out it was touch. So when I would hold his wrist and touch his back, he finished all of his food. And that was game changer for me, to realize that you don't need to be able to speak with someone to be able to know how to appreciate and love them.
Yeah, that's beautiful and so true. That's incredible. And I just want to touch on what you had mentioned, Peter, about, the work that, CNAs and caregivers do. And I'm speaking professional caregivers. It is often unseen and unheralded, if you will. And I know for our company, we own a home care company here in Michigan, and during COVID, it was all about, frontline heroes and this and that. And, but often the caregivers were getting overlooked. And then, within the year or so of COVID, they started getting recognized. And, we've had caregivers where they just, they feel like they, not for us, but just in general, as the industry, as a caregiver profession as a whole, they feel overlooked. And, we tell them, you're the top man on the totem pole here, because you are on the front lines in the truest sense. You're helping that person when our case managers aren't there, the family's not there. It's you and that person. You're making sure they get their meds on time so that they don't have a relapse or have some catastrophic event. You're making sure they don't fall. You're making sure they can use the restroom safely. They're getting their hygiene. and I think it's still just so overlooked and almost taken for granted. And they are truly heroes in every sense of the word. And we always try to give them the recognition that they deserve, both through the podcast, but also through our company. So, thank you for mentioning that.
It makes me think about, the frontline caregivers are kind of like the Navy SEALs. They do a job that they can't talk about, or people don't want to hear about, or they can't say because of HIPAA or privacy. And it's as hard as Navy SEALs in the sense that I've never worked a double shift in my life. I don't think I've ever worked a job that I've had to work on holidays or my sibling's birthday or my grandmother's birthday or Christmas and so forth, but they don't get the same recognition. At least when a Navy SEAL gets to retire, they get to walk around with the patch and, some of us salute them or thank them for their service. That's the way we should be treating frontline caregivers.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great point. And I will add to that. And sometimes they're going places nobody else wants to go too. I want to talk about your storytelling because I just think you do such a magnificent job of it, and your analogies and comparisons are just so spot on. How can storytelling become a practical tool for caregiver recruitment, retention, and building that culture?
Yeah, that's the number one objective that I have when I'm helping companies or industries or state associations or tell their story. It's kind of like an employee story. I think that the reason that I find it extremely effective is because in marketing, whether you're a trained marketer or not, Lance, you know that you have to show, not tell. And when you tell people how great you are, people don't believe you. When you have other people show, your employees, your staff get to be that person showing it. That's a game changer. And so when we're doing this, we know that a lot of the people we are interviewing, they are cutting these clips up. They're putting them on their HR page, their recruitment page, and then the exact same thing. They're using these as tours. They're putting this on their homepage to show off their facilities and their communities and what their unique selling proposition is. There's one thing that I would probably add, maybe two things that I would add to it. One is, it's not the same thing as social media. Long form broadcast quality is much different than a 30-second clip or 90-second clip on TikTok. Lance, that if I listen to your podcast, which 2 hours ago, I met a fellow Chilean, Paula Mueller, who was on your podcast, I think, from CareLink 360. And I immediately said, this is absolutely crazy. I paused your podcast. I Googled her. She wasn't on LinkedIn. I went to her website. I called her 1-800 number, left a message for her, told her that I'd lived in Chile for 15 years and I work in long-term care. She called me back 10 minutes later on her cell phone. Now, that's not going to happen from social media, right? I listened to her. I fell in love with what her story is, you being the spokesperson and having your verse and her story between my ears and headphones has a much bigger impact and lasting impact on my brain and my emotions than social media. And then the second thing I think that makes a big difference is the team that I film people worth caring about documentaries with is the same production company and crew and cameras and sound that I film my TV show with in South America. So the 8K cameras that you see on Netflix, those are the same cameras that we're filming this with. And that's what we're trying to do this year. We're trying to get our documentaries on Amazon Prime, Samsung, Roku, and Netflix.
That's incredible. Well, good luck. I know we don't have the 8Ks here, but we have the 4K Canons, and they're and that does make a difference too. Just to kind of segue here, we originally started with a Panasonic 4K, and after maybe 10 episodes, our video guy's like, you really need to move up a notch on the camera. So yeah, no, that's incredible. And that familiarity helps tremendously, right? I mean, they know you, you know them, you guys get your, your system down, and it makes all the difference in the world. But talking about marketing, Peter, you run a marketing agency that's fully remote and powered mostly by former interns. How does working in a human-first industry like caregiving shape how you build your teams at Strategic Pete?
I've never been asked that question. I immediately think of the 5 languages of love. So I have a book that's going to be published in the next 30 days. It's called Interns to A Players. And it is a guidebook. It is a playbook that teaches CEOs who struggle with remote culture, remote teams, on how to build a team. And I would say the number one takeaway from that book in relation to your question is I try to figure out interns' love language within 7 days of them starting working with me. And I do that with a daily survey that is sent to their Slack or their email that they have to fill out before they close their computer for the day. And the question that goes out at that to figure out their love language, and outside of work, we'd call it languages of appreciation. I might not use love language with, a 20-year-old person and be inappropriate. But I ask them, what is one thing that you've done amazingly today? And use words to compliment yourself. And usually what they tell me what they did well will give me insight into what they feel or how they want to be appreciated. So it might be organization, acts of service. It might be feedback, words of affirmation. It might be quality time. They were a good listener and they took down notes. And so that's the number one thing. And I think that goes back, to my example of where I worked as a CNA and tried to figure out the person's love language. Even though you and I may never meet in person, Lance, if you and I were to work together, I would try to figure out your love language, because if I figure out how you want to be appreciated, I can motivate you. The same thing, it carries over between long-term care. If I want you to be healthy and have dignity and live a great rest 6 months of your life or 5 years of your life, the same thing when I'm working with an intern.
Yeah, well, that's awesome, and I think that makes all the difference in the world, Peter. We've interviewed tens of thousands of caregivers and we've been in business for just over 13 years. And the people that hire on, over 75%, they stay. I mean, we have people that have been with us 11, 12, close to 13 years since we started. And it's because we recognize they need those affirmations. They need to be appreciated, because often, kind of going back to something you said previously, when we're interviewing somebody, we realize they're bringing their experiences from wherever else they were hired or worked at into our company. Mm-hmm. And we literally had somebody once say, well, that's what the other company said, or, that's this or that. And, our case manager, or not our case manager, but our recruiting manager who was doing the interview had said, look, we've had caregivers who said X, Y, and Z also, and they didn't follow through. But that was them. That's not you. Just like your previous employers were them, not us. We're looking at you as a clean slate. Look at us and give us the opportunity not just to tell you, but to show you we're not just saying these things, because it's too easy to go get another job anywhere else. We want them to be invested in us like we invest in them. And it does make all the difference in the world. It's not just a bottom line game. It's about a person-centered game where, when you need somebody to cover a shift, they're invested. They're more likely to help however is needed at the time, rather than if you just take them for granted. But, talking about us ever meeting in person, you mentioned you were in Toledo, Ohio not too long ago, and we're about an hour from Toledo. So we had our opportunity, Peter. But what would a season 4 look like if you stepped outside of senior care after filming in Nebraska, Ohio, and New Mexico, and maybe you explored another emotionally demanding profession?
Yeah. So I currently have 3 unique industries right now who are asking me to do a version of People Worth Caring About for them in 2026. The first one is solid waste, which I have no idea anything about it. And my TV show is Dirty Jobs. So it's a Spanish version of Mike Rowe's show in Latin America. And so I've done 100 different jobs and I speak about that around the country, but I've never done anything in solid waste. So that would be really beautiful. The second one is electricians. And what I love about it is when I met with the executive director and with their marketing director, they asked, what if we want to go big? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, is there a chance that we could do 3 seasons in a row and we bring in an apprentice, and the first season is about learning and why this person, we follow them second year where they're working, and then third year that person is training an apprentice, and we look at it from a professor. And I said, that's a fantastic idea.
I love that idea.
Me too. I love it when someone is, much more creative than I had in my mind. And then the third industry is plumbing. So in the words of this CEO, she said, I'm tired of people making plumber and butt crack jokes. I want you to show that these people are critical for our hygiene and for our safety in this country. And we have a shortage, and these people need their story to be told. And so that's going to be really, really unique. What's cool about that, Lance, and I feel like you'd be perfect at this if I were to do a documentary in Detroit someday, which is, instead of me being in camera, I'll be behind the camera, and we find like a local executive or leader who then would be the face of people worth caring about for that industry. And that was a cool idea from her.
That's a very cool idea. I love that. And just to add to your list, because I mean, it's really limitless, right? I think what would be really fascinating would be getting like a 4th-year medical student. Then when they graduate, they're a 1-year resident, or an intern rather, and then, follow them for that 3 critical years, because it's such a transition. I think that would be fascinating, kind of like they're saying with the electrician, right?
Yeah, I'm speaking to a hospital association who asked me for my ideas, and I'm taking notes as we record, Lance. I apologize. You just gave me, I'm going to have to send you a gift and some commission if this happens.
No. Just come back, get close to Michigan, and I'll take you out to lunch and, have you come by, and we can maybe do another interview in our in-person studio. I want to kind of talk a little bit more about conversations. So what conversations are you hoping this series is really going to start with policymakers and care leaders?
The one that hit home for me is a post that I saw on social media about 2 weeks after the documentary People Worth Caring About came out on YouTube. And it was a woman named Rosalie. And she said something along the words of, I didn't know anything about long-term care, but I watched Peter's first episode, and I binge watched all 7 episodes. Wow. And I want you all to go out and watch it, because it changed my perception about long-term care forever. If I'm ever honored to live in a place like that, I would be honored to live in a place like that. And that's really, really, really impactful for me, because I think it's going at changing the end user's perception, which for me, I as a kind of a deeper, vulnerable person, I think in life we are often motivated, or we do things based out of fear, not out of what we want, out of our desires. We talk about goals, but oftentimes we end up running away from our fears. And it terrifies me that we have 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds afraid to go into long-term care because they have a misconception of how great it can be. And then the second thing that I like, and this isn't my idea, this came from Nebraska. Nebraska is taking clips of the documentary, and they've geofenced the U.S. Capitol, so they use it for advocacy. So they're showing all of our congressmen and women and senators who don't have the time to go into a long-term care facility and see how important it is, and they're showing it to them.
I'll be in DC. We're recording and people all know now, but I will be in DC towards the end of May at the Elizabeth Dole Foundation's convening and doing some on-site interviews and things with some policymakers and everything. So I'll plug it for you too, face to face for them, Peter.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about your workbooks that you've created for residents, students, caregivers to really accompany the documentary. What role do these play in really deepening the understanding and the impact that the series is going to have on people?
I think that the workbooks have served 2 roles. And before I kind of answer that, I'll tell you a little bit what those workbooks are. So Nebraska has a really cool program where they get to have a career day for middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they get to show them in an hour or 2 what it means to build your career in healthcare, so they can, recruit this 5th grader or this sophomore into thinking about long-term care or acute care. So we build out workbooks so that this middle schooler could watch one episode of People Worth Caring About, and then that episode would have personalized questions aimed at a fifth grader for them to answer that would get them to engage with that episode. And then secondarily, we did a workbook for residents. So residents of anywhere in the country could watch an episode, and then they will have 5 to 7 questions that their activities director could guide them through so that they can relate with the people they saw on screen, with the people who take care of them. And then we did a workbook for HR and executives so they can do this with their internal team. So a team watches one episode and then they can relate and say, hey, you know, Lance on episode 4 in Wakefield was beautiful about, you know, he's a maintenance man and he's been here for 20 years. He's never been a frontline caregiver, but he's just as critical as anybody else. Who's our Lance? So it gives you some time to give a shout out to, you know, the person who might not normally get the recognition and live off of that good energy of what's happening from the documentary.
That's beautiful, Peter. I love that you're doing that. I'm going to add another suggestion just because, you know, this one's a little close, near and dear to our heart. You should follow a home care provider around. Because, you know, I tell people the home care industry is unlike any other animal. There is a need, there is a place for facility care, but if your loved one is opting and choosing to remain in their own home, maybe they get 24/7 care, right? The difference there is you have a caregiver and you have the client. We don't call them patients. And if there's an emergency, you can't go to the nurse's desk and get a nurse. You can't, you know, there's not support around. So, I mean, that responsibility and that skill set has to be at the, you know, pristine top of the pyramid, because that person is really the line of defense between keeping that person safe, making sure everything's adequately addressed, and maybe ending up in a catastrophic emergency room visit or something. I think, you know, I just think it's a whole different beast, and it's really an interesting one.
You know, when we turn off the cameras, I'll ask you for some advice on who I should reach out to. So one of the stories that's close to heart that I want to do in 2026 is a disease that my brother has. My brother has what's called the suicide disease. It's the most painful, chronic, painful disease in the United States. It's called chronic regional pain syndrome, CRPS. There's a documentary on Netflix called Take Care of Maya. Maya had CRPS, and my brother's had CRPS for 15 years. So I've always been interested in that, and I would love to, you know, put a cool project on there like home care, like you say. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry to hear that too. You know, you're a busy person. I'm a busy person. I get asked this quite a bit, so I thought I would ask you, how do you balance being a creative, a marketer, a dad, and an advocate, and sometimes all in the same day? Like, how do you prioritize and juggle that?
I would start off by giving credit to my amazing wife. She does everything that I'm bad at. So like bills and invoices and accounting and kind of taking care of everything in the house. I couldn't change the oil in my car. She could. So she's kind of plays the traditional masculine role in that. And then secondarily, I'd give a lot of credit to my parents. One of the goals in my life when I came back from South America was to move my parents and be close to them, to take care of them as they get older and put them in long-term care at the last moment. And I just convinced them a year ago to move. They live about 8 blocks away from me now in Wichita, Kansas. And they help me so much. My dad and I take my son to school every single day, Monday through Friday, and he picks him up with me. So my son has he has a social network around him that looks like Latin America, that had I not worked in long-term care or lived in Latin America, I don't know if I would have been able to emphasize that or create that with the intention that I did now. And then kind of from a professional point of view, I'm pretty careful with my morning hours. So between about 6 a.m. and 11 a.m., I try not to have any meetings other than things that are creative or strategic. Almost all emails or kind of check-in calls and so forth, those are going to happen from 11 to 3 when I'm a little bit more lethargic. And then 2 more items is I do have an amazing team. I have 15 people that started work, or 13 of them were interns. So I've created an amazing culture where people know how to fill in where I'm weak. And then there was one other item that I was going to say that I forgot about, Lance. Apologize.
That's okay. If you think of it, just mention it. I love hearing that about your son and his grandpa, your father. My grandparents lived down south, just outside of Kentucky. It's about 6-7 hours from us. And from the time I was old enough, I would go spend my summers with them. It was just the greatest memories I've ever had, and still to this day, next to maybe the birth of my children and my marriage. But, your son is so fortunate. How old is he, Peter?
He's 8. He's 8.
Yeah.
How old are yours?
I have a 12, 10, and an 8-year-old.
Oh, perfect. I'll have to talk you into coming to visit where I live, because I live in the middle of a zoo in Wichita, Kansas. Right now, as you and I are speaking, I'm in a zoo, and it's just a great place for that age group. It's one of the few zoos where you can swim with penguins and otters and feed rhinos and so forth. So maybe this summer I'm going to meet you in person in Kansas.
But let me just back up here. So now I'm thinking of the movie We Bought a Zoo. Is that what?
I'm the fat version of Matt Damon.
Are you seriously? That is incredible.
Yeah. It's really cool. They hired me as a chief strategist about 5 years ago as a fractional role. Yeah. And they gave me a house as part of that job. And I still live here ever since. And I still help them with consulting.
That is really, really cool. That needs to be the film right there.
Yeah.
Oh, how neat. As we close out here, Peter, I want to thank you so much for your time and for what you're doing for the industry and for awareness and storytelling and just showcasing the real side of long-term care. We'll have all this in the show notes, also up on the screen for the people watching, but for those listening, where would you like people to go to either connect with you, to learn more about you, to learn about the series? Where should people be heading to?
Go to LinkedIn. I am the only Peter Murphy Lewis on LinkedIn that I know of. And if you're interested in the documentary, you can currently find it on YouTube. Just look for People Worth Caring About. If Amazon or Netflix picks it up, it won't be on there for long. So go check it out in the next 3 or 4 months.
Wonderful. And, finally, what are you hoping that People Worth Caring leaves behind? Like, what's the legacy you're wanting it to have? Not just as a docuseries, but really as a movement. What are you hoping long from now that it's the impact? What's the impact you hope that it has?
I think that there is a higher objective that I don't share very often, which is around humanity. It's about being connected and being understood. I think those are 2 basic needs that we don't think about nowadays in the United States. And that is a movement to make that happen. So you could call it a movement of care. You could call it a movement of connection. I often say for people who don't want to get all fluffy, if I'm talking to a 50-year-old man who doesn't believe in that, this is a movement against cell phones so that we talk to each other and we hold each other's hands, our 5-year-olds and our 85-year-olds.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I loved hearing you say, we have kids obviously the same age. At our kids' school, there's a huge movement. There's posters in the halls. One of our teachers is kind of leading this movement, and it's all about don't get your kids a cell phone. They don't need it. It's elementary, and my oldest is in middle school, 12. Cell phones are not something you need at this age. There's times, I'm sure for you as well, I wish I didn't even have a cell phone, but unfortunately with what you do and what I do, it's a necessity. But that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Peter Murphy Lewis, I'm going to add a title here: Renaissance man, zoo resident, filmmaker, long-term advocate, and the founder of Strategic Pete. Thank you so much for sharing your time and story with us today.
Appreciate it, Lance.
All right. Have a good day. Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to say thank you again to Peter Murphy Lewis for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.